I need to tell you something I've never told anyone. Not completely. Not like this. My name is Maria, and I'm 62 years old now. I have gray hair that catches the light differently than it used to, and hands that know the weight of work. But 43 years ago, I was 19, pregnant, and thrown out of a car like garbage on a dirt road by the people I had trusted with my life. For decades, I carried this story in silence. I rebuilt myself, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, never speaking their names aloud. And then, 2 months ago, the impossible happened. They came to my door asking for work. They didn't recognize me, but I recognized them. This is that story. I want you to imagine something with me. Picture yourself at 19 years old. You have nothing but the clothes you wear and the hope that someone, somewhere, might give you a chance. That was me in 1981. I had taken a job as a housemaid for the Henderson family. Mr. Richard Henderson owned 3 car dealerships, and his wife Patricia wore jewelry that cost more than most people made in a year. They lived in a mansion with 12 rooms, marble floors, and windows, so tall they made me feel like I was living inside a cathedral. I was invisible to them, completely invisible. I would dust around Patricia as she talked on the phone about charity galas, and she would look right through me as if I were part of the furniture. Richard would leave his coffee cup wherever he finished drinking, never once saying thank you when I cleaned it up. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a job, a small room in the servants' quarters, and 3 meals a day. That was more than I'd had in years. But you know what happens when you're invisible for too long. You start to believe you don't exist. You move through the world like a ghost, cleaning up after people who live in the light while you remain in the shadows. I was so lonely in that house, so desperately, achingly lonely, that when Robert, their oldest son, started noticing me, really seeing me, I felt like I was coming alive for the first time. Let me tell you where you're watching this from. Are you at home, maybe late at night like I am right now? Are you in another country, another time zone, hearing this story, when the sun is shining? I want to know. Leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are, because somehow, knowing you're out there listening, makes this easier to say. Robert was 23, home from college for the summer. He had his father's dark hair but his mother's green eyes, and when he smiled at me in the hallway, I felt something I had never felt before. He would find excuses to come to the kitchen when I was working. He would ask me questions about my life, my dreams, my family. No one had ever asked me those things before. No one had ever acted like my answers mattered. I was so young, so naive. I thought what we had was real. I thought he saw something in me worth loving. When he would sneak down to my room after his parents were asleep, when he would hold me and whisper that I was beautiful, that I was special, I believed him. I held those words like precious stones, turning them over in my mind during the long days of cleaning and cooking and pretending I didn't exist. I found out I was pregnant in September. I remembered the exact moment because I was standing in their pristine white bathroom, looking at the test I had bought with money I'd saved from my tiny salary. The plus sign appeared like a pink scar across the white plastic, and my whole world shifted. I sat on that cold marble floor and cried, not from sadness, but from a strange, overwhelming joy. I thought this baby meant Robert and I had a future. I thought this child would make our love real, legitimate, something his parents would have to acknowledge. I was so wrong. When I told Robert, his face went pale, then cold, then angry. He looked at me like I had tricked him, like I had done this on purpose to trap him. He said words I still remember, words that cut so deep they left scars I can still feel today. He said I was delusional if I thought he would ever be with someone like me. He said I was the help, that what we had was just fun, that I meant nothing to him, nothing, but it got worse. Robert told his parents. I'll never forget that evening in October when Patricia called me into the living room. The whole family was there, Richard in his leather chair, reading the newspaper. Patricia on the sofa with her perfect posture, and Robert standing by the fireplace refusing to look at me. The room smelled like expensive perfume and wood polish, and I stood there in my uniform feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. But Patricia spoke first. Her voice was ice cold like she was discussing the weather. She said they knew about my condition. She said they knew I had been trying to seduce their son, to trap him into marriage with a baby. The word trap hit me like a slap. I tried to explain, tried to tell them that Robert and I loved each other, that this baby was wanted, that we could make this work. Richard didn't even look up from his newspaper when he said, "Pack your things, you have an hour." An hour. to pack a life, to gather the few possessions I owned and leave the only stability I had known. I begged them. I actually got on my knees on their marble floor and begged. I told them I had nowhere to go, no money, no family. I told them I would work harder, take less pay, anything to stay. Patricia looked at me with such disgust, like I was something dirty she had found on the bottom of her shoe. She said, "Girls like you always land on your feet. Don't pretend this is anyone's fault but your own." They didn't even let me pack properly. Robert, the man who had whispered that he loved me just weeks before, threw my few belongings into a battered suitcase. He wouldn't meet my eyes, not once. Richard drove me himself, in silence, to the edge of town. I remember sitting in the back of that Mercedes, my hand on my still flat belly, watching the lights of their mansion disappear in the distance. He stopped at a crossroads where the pavement ended and dirt began. It was getting dark, and the October air was cold. He got out, pulled my suitcase from the trunk, and set it on the ground. I was still sitting in the back seat, unable to believe this was really happening. He opened my door and said, "Get out," just like that, "Get out," like I was trash he was taking to the dump. I stood there on that dirt road with my suitcase, watching the taillights of his car disappear into the darkness. The silence was complete. No cars, no lights, no people. Just me and the baby growing inside me, and the terrible knowledge that I was completely, utterly alone. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know some of you watching this understand what it feels like to have the ground disappear beneath your feet. Maybe you've been abandoned, betrayed, thrown away by people who were supposed to care about you. If this story is touching something in your heart, if it's bringing up your own memories of survival, would you hit that like button? And if you haven't already, subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in our pain. I spent that first night in a bus station, not sleeping, just sitting on a hard plastic chair, holding my suitcase and trying to figure out what to do next. I had $43 to my name. $43 and a baby on the way. I kept thinking Robert would change his mind, that he would come looking for me. I kept thinking someone from that family would realize what they had done and come back for me. No one came. The next few months are a blur of shame and survival. I stayed in a women's shelter downtown, sharing a room with 3 other women who had their own stories of being thrown away. I cleaned office buildings at night for cash, under the table, scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans, while my belly grew bigger and my back ached. I remember standing in those empty office buildings at 2 in the morning, my reflection caught in the dark windows, looking like a ghost of the girl I used to be. The other women at the shelter tried to help. Rosa, who had been there the longest, taught me how to stretch $1, how to make a can of soup last 2 days, how to sleep when your heart is broken and your future feels impossible. She would rub my back when the baby kicked too hard, and she would tell me stories about her own children to help me believe that mothers could be strong, that babies could be blessings even when they arrived in darkness. I gave birth alone. Well, not completely alone. There was a nurse named Janet who held my hand during the worst of it, who wiped my forehead with a cool cloth and told me I was brave. But there was no father in the waiting room, no family bringing flowers, no celebration. Just me and this tiny, perfect baby girl who opened her eyes and looked at me like she had been waiting her whole life to meet me. I named her Hope, because that's what she was. That's what she gave me when I had nothing left. Those first years were the hardest thing I've ever lived through. Hope and I moved from shelter to shelter, staying wherever would take us for a few weeks or months. I worked any job I could find, cleaning houses, waitressing at diners, stocking shelves at grocery stores. I would carry Hope with me when I could, leave her with other mothers when I couldn't. I was always tired, always worried, always counting pennies and praying they would stretch far enough. But something else was happening during those hard years. I was learning, not just how to survive, but how to notice things, how to see what needed fixing, what needed improving, what opportunities other people missed. When I cleaned houses, I started noticing how the wealthy families lived, how they managed their money, how they talked about investments in property. When I worked at the diner, I watched how the owner ran the business, how he dealt with suppliers, how he calculated profits. I was invisible again, but this time I used it differently. This time I listened, I learned, I saved every penny I could. When Hope was 5, I found a job at a small boarding house on the outskirts of town. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was elderly and needed help with maintenance and cleaning. She let Hope and me live in a small apartment above the office in exchange for work. It wasn't much, 2 rooms with thin walls and drafty windows, but it was ours. For the first time since I had been thrown out of that car, I had a home. Mrs. Chen taught me about running a business. She showed me how to keep books, how to deal with difficult tenants, how to fix things that broke instead of calling repairmen. I learned to patch walls, unclog drains, paint rooms, balance budgets. My hands got rough and my back got strong, and slowly, very slowly, I started to feel like I could handle whatever life threw at me. Mrs. Chen was getting older, and when Hope turned 8, she offered to sell me the boarding house. I had been saving every penny for 3 years, living on rice and beans and Hope, putting away $5 or $10 whenever I could. It wasn't enough for the full price, but Mrs. Chen agreed to let me pay her in installments. She said she could see something in me that I was just starting to see in myself. I worked 16-hour days. I cleaned every room myself, cooked meals for the tenants, fixed broken faucets and painted walls and balanced books late into the night. Hope would do her homework at the kitchen table while I planned repairs and counted receipts. She was so patient with me during those years, so understanding when I was tired or stressed or worried about money. She would curl up next to me in our small bed and tell me about her day at school, and I would listen to her voice and think about how different our lives were becoming. The boarding house started to turn a profit. Not much at first, but enough to cover expenses and save a little. I reinvested everything back into the property, new mattresses, fresh paint, better heating, small improvements that made tenants want to stay longer. Word spread that Mrs. Maria ran a clean, safe, affordable place, and I started getting more requests than I had rooms. That's when I heard about the Henderson mansion. It had been empty for almost 10 years. Richard Henderson had died of a heart attack, and Patricia had moved to Florida. Robert had taken over the car dealerships but had no interest in the family home. The house was deteriorating, the garden was overgrown, and the real estate taxes were piling up. It was going to be sold at auction. I remember standing outside those tall iron gates, looking up at the house where I had once been invisible, where I had been thrown away like garbage. The windows were dark, the paint was peeling, and weeds were growing through cracks in the circular driveway. It looked like a monument to abandoned dreams. I knew I had to have it. I had been saving for 12 years by then. Every penny I could spare had gone into a savings account at the small-town bank. I had enough for the down payment, but just barely. The monthly payments would be steep, and I would have to take out business loans for the renovations I knew it would need. It was a risk that could destroy everything I had built. But I also knew something else. I knew that house better than anyone. I knew every room, every closet, every hidden corner. I had cleaned it for months when I was 19. I knew where the good bones were, where the problems would be, what it would take to bring it back to life. I bought it at auction on a cold February morning. I was the only bidder. For the next 3 years, I lived in that house while I renovated it room by room. Hope, who was now 11, would help me after school holding flashlights while I rewired outlets, passing me tools while I fixed plumbing, choosing paint colors for the guest rooms I was creating. She had grown into this beautiful, smart, strong girl who understood hard work and wasn't afraid of it. I turned the Henderson mansion into the finest bed and breakfast in the county. I kept some of the grandeur, the marble floors, the tall windows, the ornate moldings, but I made it warm where it had been cold, welcoming where it had been intimidating. I planted flowers in the garden, installed comfortable furniture in the common areas, and created guest rooms that felt like luxury retreats. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sleeping in the master bedroom where Patricia Henderson had once refused to acknowledge my existence. I was cooking meals in the kitchen where I had once been invisible. I was running a successful business in the house where I had once been told I was nothing, but I never told anyone the history. I never spoke the Henderson name aloud or shared my story with guests or neighbors. I buried those memories deep and focused on the present, on building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Hope grew up in that house. She graduated valedictorian from high school, got a full scholarship to college, and became a teacher. She married a kind man named David, who treats her like she's precious, and they gave me 2 grandbabies who call me abuela and think I hung the moon. Hope knows bits and pieces of our early story, but not everything. Not the depth of the betrayal, or the complete devastation of those first years. Some pain is too personal to share, even with the people you love most. I ran that bed and breakfast for 22 years. I earned a reputation for excellence, for hospitality, for creating a place where people felt genuinely cared for. Travel magazines wrote articles about us. Wedding planners recommended us to their most important clients. I employed 12 people from the community and paid them well, with benefits and respect. I had become everything the Henderson family had told me I could never be. I had become successful, respected, financially secure. I had raised a daughter who was changing the world one classroom at a time. I had created beauty where there had been cruelty, and I had done it all in silence. Last year, at 61, I decided to sell. I kept the bed and breakfast but hired a manager to handle the day-to-day operations. I moved into a smaller house across town, closer to Hope and the grandchildren. I started volunteering at the women's shelter where I had once stayed, helping other mothers who had been thrown away understand that survival was possible. I thought my story with the Henderson family was over. I thought that chapter had been closed decades ago. I was wrong. 2 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in March, someone knocked on my door. I was in my garden, planting tomatoes for the spring, when I heard the sound. I wasn't expecting anyone. Hope was at work, the grandchildren were at school, and most people know to call before coming by. I opened the door, and there they were. Robert and Patricia Henderson, 43 years older, but unmistakably them. Patricia's hair was completely white now, styled in the same perfect waves she had always worn. She had aged well. Clearly money had bought her good skincare and regular treatments, but there were lines around her eyes that spoke of years I knew nothing about. Robert was heavier now, with gray at his temples, and the soft look of a man who had never done physical labor, but his green eyes were the same eyes that had looked right through me when I begged them not to throw me away. They didn't recognize me. Not at first, not at all. Patricia smiled, the polite smile wealthy people use when they want something from people they consider beneath them. She said they had heard I ran a successful business, that I had a reputation for excellence and discretion. They had a proposal for me. Robert stepped forward and introduced himself, as if I could have forgotten his name, his face, his voice. He explained that he and his mother were in financial trouble. The car dealerships had failed during the recession. They had made bad investments, lived beyond their means, lost most of their money. Patricia's house in Florida was in foreclosure. They needed work. They had heard, Robert said, that I sometimes hired people for special projects. They were willing to do anything, cleaning, maintenance, yard work, whatever I needed. They weren't proud, he said, they just needed a chance. The irony was so sharp it took my breath away. Here were the people who had thrown me out pregnant and penniless, standing on my doorstep asking for the exact kind of work they had once considered beneath them. Here was the woman who had looked at me with such disgust, now wringing her hands and talking about needing a chance. Here was the man who had called me delusional for thinking I meant anything to him, now hoping I would show him the mercy he had never shown me. I stood in my doorway, in my house, on my property, and I felt a kind of power I had never experienced before. Not the power to hurt them, but the power to choose, the power to decide who deserved my compassion and who had forfeited it. I invited them in. They sat in my living room, looking around at my furniture, my photographs, my comfortable life, and I could see them calculating, wondering how someone like me had achieved so much. Patricia complimented my decor with the same condescending tone she had once used to criticize my cleaning. Robert kept glancing at family photos on my mantel, probably wondering who these people were who clearly loved me. If you're still with me in this story, if you're wondering what I did next, I want to ask you to do something. If this story is speaking to you, if it's reminding you that sometimes life gives us chances to reclaim our power, would you share this video? Send it to someone who needs to be reminded that survival is possible, that dignity can be rebuilt, that sometimes justice comes in ways we never expected. Because what happened next changed everything for me. I listened to their story, really listened. They told me about the business failures, the mounting debt, the foreclosure proceedings. They talked about having to sell jewelry, furniture, family heirlooms. They spoke about the humiliation of asking for help, of having to consider doing work they had never imagined doing. Patricia actually cried while she talked about losing her house in Florida. Real tears over losing a house. I sat there thinking about the 19-year-old girl who had been thrown out of a car with nowhere to go, and I felt ... nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no revenge. Just a kind of cold, clear understanding that this was exactly what it looked like when the world turned upside down. When they finished their story, they looked at me hopefully, desperately, the way I had once looked at them. I told them I would consider their request. I asked them to come back in a week for my answer. They thanked me profusely as they left. Patricia shook my hand and told me I seemed like such a kind person, such a good Christian woman. Robert lingered at the door and said he could tell I understood what it meant to work hard, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I almost laughed. Almost. That week was the longest week of my life. Not because I was trying to decide what to do. I knew what I was going to do from the moment they walked away. But because I was finally processing 43 years of buried anger and pain and betrayal. I cried for the first time in decades. Real crying, the kind that comes from deep in your chest and leaves you exhausted. I cried for the 19-year-old girl who had been thrown away. I cried for the young mother who had cleaned toilets at night while her baby slept in a shelter. I cried for all the years I had carried this secret, all the strength it had taken to rebuild, all the silence I had maintained to protect the life I had created. But I also felt something else. I felt proud. So deeply, completely proud of what I had become, what I had built, how I had survived. I had taken their cruelty and transformed it into strength. I had taken their rejection and turned it into self-reliance. I had taken their contempt and created a life filled with love and respect and genuine accomplishment. They came back exactly a week later. Same time, same desperate politeness. Patricia had brought homemade cookies as a gesture of goodwill. Robert had printed out a resume listing skills he clearly didn't have but hoped he could learn. I invited them to sit down. I looked at them for a long moment, really looked, saw the fear in their eyes, the way their hands trembled slightly, the careful way they held themselves like people trying not to appear as desperate as they felt. I saw two people who had lived their entire lives believing they were better than others, now faced with the reality that life doesn't care about the stories we tell ourselves. And then I told them who I was. I said my name slowly, clearly. Maria Elena Rodriguez. The girl who had cleaned their house 43 years ago, the girl Robert had gotten pregnant, the girl they had thrown out of a car like garbage on a dirt road in October 1981. The silence in that room was absolute. Patricia's face went completely white. Robert's mouth actually fell open. I watched 43 years of forgotten cruelty come flooding back into their memories. I watched them remember the girl they had discarded, the baby they had rejected, the lives they had considered worthless. Robert was the first to speak. He stammered something about not recognizing me, about how much I had changed, about how sorry he was. Patricia just stared at me like she was seeing a ghost. I let them apologize. I let them stumble through explanations and justifications and desperate attempts to minimize what they had done. I let them talk about being young and scared and making mistakes. I let them say all the words they should have said 43 years ago. And then I told them what I was going to do. I was going to give them jobs, not because they deserved them, not because I forgave them, but because I had become the kind of person who understands that mercy isn't about what people deserve. It's about who you choose to be when you have the power to choose. I hired them to work in my garden, to do the kind of hard, physical, invisible labor that builds character and teaches humility. I hired them at minimum wage, with 1 day off per week, with the understanding that they would work for as long as I deemed appropriate. I hired them to learn what I had learned at 19, that honest work has dignity, that survival requires strength, that being invisible doesn't make you worthless. But I also set conditions. They would never speak to me about the past unless I brought it up first. They would treat me and everyone else who worked for me with complete respect. They would show up on time, work hard, and be grateful for the opportunity. And they would never, ever forget that their second chance was a gift, not a right. For 6 months now, they have worked in my garden. Patricia, who once wore jewelry worth more than most people's cars, spends her days weeding flower beds and watering plants. Robert, who once thought manual labor was beneath him, digs holes and spreads mulch and learns to use his hands for something productive. They are different people now, quieter, more careful with their words. Patricia actually says please and thank you, and means it. Robert has lost weight and gained something that might be wisdom, or at least humility. They both understand, I think, that they are seeing what their lives would have looked like if they had ever learned to value character over status. We don't talk about the past. We don't need to. Every day they work in my garden, they are living with the consequences of their choices. Every day they report to the woman they threw away, they are learning what it means to be grateful for a second chance they don't deserve. And me, I watch them work from my kitchen window while I drink my morning coffee, and I feel something I never expected to feel. Not revenge, not satisfaction, but a kind of peace. The circle has closed, but not in the way any of us could have predicted. Hope visits every weekend with the grandchildren, and sometimes she sees Patricia and Robert in the garden. She asks me sometimes if I know them, if they're good workers, if I trust them. I tell her they're learning, that everyone deserves a chance to grow, that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is give them the opportunity to become better than they were. She doesn't know who they are. She doesn't know that the man trimming my rose bushes is her biological father, or that the woman planting my vegetable garden is the woman who called her mother trash. Maybe someday I'll tell her. Maybe someday she'll be ready to understand that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, and that strength sometimes looks like mercy. But for now, this is enough. This strange, quiet justice where the people who threw me away now depend on me for their survival. This understanding that the girl they discarded became the woman they need. This proof that sometimes, if you wait long enough and work hard enough and refuse to let bitterness destroy you, life gives you exactly the power you need to heal. I am 62 years old now. I have gray hair and rough hands and a life filled with love. I have a daughter who changes the world and grandchildren who think their abuela is magic. I have built something beautiful from something broken. And I have learned that the best revenge is not cruelty returned, but dignity maintained. Every morning, I wake up in my own house, in my own life, surrounded by people who value me. Every morning, I choose kindness over bitterness, mercy over revenge, strength over anger. Not because they deserve it, but because I do. Because I deserve to be the kind of person who can look at her enemies and see broken people who need the same grace I once needed. This is my story. The story of a girl who was thrown away and a woman who refused to stay discarded. The story of cruelty met with strength, rejection met with resilience, contempt met with quiet dignity. If you're watching this and you've been thrown away, cast aside, told you don't matter, I want you to know something. You matter. Your story matters. Your survival matters. The life you build from the ashes of what was destroyed matters more than you can possibly imagine right now. Hold on. Work hard. Stay kind. Choose mercy when you can and strength when you must. Build something beautiful from whatever pieces you have left. And remember that sometimes the people who discard you today will need you tomorrow, and when that day comes, you get to choose who you want to be. The girl they threw out of that car 43 years ago is gone. But the woman she became is here, telling her story, offering hope to anyone who needs it. And that woman knows something the girl never could have imagined, that being thrown away was not the end of her story, it was the beginning. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here with me through this telling. If this story gave you hope, if it reminded you that survival is possible and dignity can be rebuilt, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. We all need reminders that we're stronger than we know, that love wins in the end, and that sometimes justice comes dressed as mercy. The garden is calling me now. There's work to be done, life to be tended, beauty to be created. And somewhere out there, Patricia and Robert are getting ready for another day of learning what it means to serve instead of being served, to be grateful instead of entitled, to understand that everyone deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. It took 43 years, but they're finally learning the lesson I tried to teach them the day they threw me away, that every person has value, every story matters, and that how you treat people when you have power over them says everything about who you really are. My name is Maria Elena Rodriguez. I was thrown away pregnant like trash by a rich family 43 years ago. Today, they work in my garden. And tomorrow, I'll continue to choose grace over revenge, dignity over cruelty, and hope over bitterness, because that's what survivors do. We rebuild, we rise, and we never, ever let anyone convince us we're disposable again.